I'm Andrea Motel from the Teen Advisory Board of the Rosendale Theater, and I'm here with a panel of activists to talk about the ever-important topic of gun violence awareness. This event is hosted by the Rosendale Theater, which I am currently in. Fun fact, due to COVID, there has not been an audience here for 3 months. Gun violence is an important issue to me and my generation because we are sick of feeling afraid. We should be safe. We should be kids. But instead, we keep our phones on silent in case something happens. The sad truth of the matter is, my school could be the next Parkland if people in power keep doing nothing. And by people in power, I especially mean a certain Senate Majority Leader with an A rating by the NRA. So, our job is to replace those leaders with ones that will protect us. Our job is to vote in people who will keep another Parkland from happening again. This program tonight will include an interview with our Congressman Antonio Delgado, followed by our activist panelists. But before we continue, I would like to share this message from our county executive, Pat Ryan.
Good evening, everyone. This is County Executive Pat Ryan. I really wish I could be there with you all in person, or at least over Zoom, to have this discussion, but unfortunately I can't make it tonight. But this topic, gun violence prevention and youth activism, both issues that are so important and so near and dear to my heart, I wanted to at least just add my few cents, and I appreciate you all being part of this conversation. Ending gun violence, I think, is one of the defining issues of my generation and the generation after me. It's particularly post-Columbine just been felt in such a visceral, raw way by young people. And we have seen, as they're leading, as our young people are leading on so many of the other hard issues happening in our country right now, from climate change to criminal justice reform and, of course, ending gun violence. This issue in particular was the first one where we saw young people, especially after Parkland, raise their voices in such a powerful and evocative and just raw and authentic way that it actually drove change on an issue that has been stuck and locked down for decades or even centuries. To me, the power of young people to just speak with a real sense of moral clarity is so important, especially at this time in our country when we have such challenging issues to address that feel intractable. But if you can just boil them down to the human sense that in this case, young people going to school, going to church, going to concerts, should not feel like they're going into a war zone, should not feel unsafe. Those are the exact places, the most important places where they can and must feel safe. So I think there's also a really interesting connection point and consistent theme throughout that discussion about ending gun violence and many of the discussions we're having about law enforcement in our country. In the last week or two, I wrote an op-ed calling for the stopping of the militarization of our local police forces, and it's provoked some serious conversation here, and I know these conversations are happening elsewhere. And here's how I think about this. On one side, you have a Second Amendment wildly misinterpreted that allows people in our country to have assault weapons I carried in combat designed for war on our streets here in the country. Then on the other side, you have law enforcement, the vast majority of whom are doing the right things and trying to do their job, who say, look, you've got bad folks with weapons of war. We need our own weapons of war and body armor and armored vehicles and tanks to be able to protect ourselves from them. So you create this escalating cycle of violence where all sides are armed and more armed and more geared up. And then the people that they're supposed to be protecting in both institutions, young people in schools, communities in our own cities and towns, especially communities of color, the people that are supposed to feel safe feel increasingly less safe. So we have to address all sides of this issue, both in disarming those that have, in my opinion, no need, no legitimate need for weapons of war as civilians. And the same thing, we have to demilitarize our local law enforcement and get back to the place where we're all just actually humans again, recognizing our shared humanity and looking out for each other, taking care of each other, and ultimately showing love and kindness towards each other. And on all of these issues, the common thread to me, just to sum up my thoughts and comments, are that we have seen young people, even, I guess, maybe I'm not that young, I'm just turned 38, so even for me, hearing the high school students now talk about these issues, they are prompting me and pushing me as an elected leader to do even more and to move more quickly and with more urgency and aggressiveness. So thank you to all the young people that are inspiring us and driving us, and to all of us, let's just continue to keep pushing, having these conversations, and then turning them into action. So thanks for tuning in and letting me be part of this conversation, and I look forward to working with all of you on these issues going forward.
Thank you, Pat Ryan, for being so passionate about this issue. You've done an amazing job helping our community in these times. Thank you. Next up, we have an interview with the one, the only District 19 Congressman, Antonio Delgado.
Yeah. All right.
We're rolling.
Thank you for coming in virtually, if not physically. And
I'll always be with you. Good to see you.
Great. Good to see you too. All right. So you have supported the Bipartisan Background Checks Act and the Enhanced Background Checks Act. Could you tell me about these?
Well, on the heels of such a outpouring of energy from young people after Parkland who did so much to highlight the urgent need to have real legislation that addresses the fact that we are witnessing too much life lost to guns in this country. And it is long overdue that we do something to demonstrate that not only are we aware of this fact, but that we want to change the outcomes. And when you have 90% of folks who have been crying out for universal background checks, it should be a no-brainer. And so when we passed H.R. 8 in the House, we were able to do something that, in my opinion, was long overdue. And that was ensure that all gun sale purchases have to meet a background check. Now, there are some exceptions, between relatives, or if you're loaning a gun at a shooting range or you're out there hunting with your friends. But as far as sales, no matter where that sale is happening, it is important that we understand the background of those individuals making that purchase. The other bill, which closes the Charleston loophole, which addresses what happened in South Carolina tragically, almost I think 5 years ago now, to those individuals who were there and praying in church and lost their lives, to somebody who not only obviously had some darkness in his heart, but the way the law was written, because his background check had not cleared within 3 days, he was automatically able to purchase or receive the firearm. So this bill would close that loophole and extend the time from 3 days to 10 days. Wait an extra 7 more days just to make sure that we keep guns out of the hands of people who don't have any business possessing them.
Right. These both make perfect sense.
Yes, they do, and they're supported broadly. These are bills that have wide bipartisan support. I'm talking 90+% of the population supports these endeavors.
How long do you think it'll take for a Senate vote?
Well, that's a tough question because, we passed these bills earlier last year. We've been pushing for this for some time now, and the fact of the matter is, nothing's been done in the Senate. And it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that even something as universally desired as background checks continues to be held up, because of special interests that have certain individuals who call themselves public servants. They're not acting in the interest of the public. They're acting in the interest of a special group of people who've made it their business to hold up progress. So, we have to change power dynamics if we really want to be in a position to move these things forward.
We have to vote them out.
That too.
Yes, these politicians still take money from the NRA, and why do you think that is?
Well, Maitreya, I mean, the challenge is we live in a world where the role of money, generally speaking, is far too dominant. It is in every sector prioritized and glorified. And you would hope that there would be some spaces, given the nature of the work, given how important the work is, to making sure that we all can collectively be represented appropriately, where you would do everything in your power to keep the influence of money out. But you have the exact opposite dynamic in politics, where we've allowed money to overrun the system to a degree that special interests that have significant capital are able to put immense pressure on certain individuals who feel like it is their business to have to receive these contributions in order to maintain their power. So they put their power and they put the fact that the money they receive as the only means to that power ahead of the very people that they represent. So the short answer is we have to reduce the influence of money in politics. The longer answer is we have to make sure that our electorate is incredibly informed and capable and able and willing to make change with their feet by going to the polls and, as you said, voting these folks out who are taking money from special interest groups that we know they should not be.
And you've been named a gun sense candidate by Moms Demand Action, an
Yes,
organization dedicated.
Love them.
Yes, they're dedicated to stopping gun violence. Can you define that a bit?
How do we stop gun violence, or what do you want me to define?
Moms Demand Action and what led you two to join forces.
Well, Moms Demand Action, first of all, that is just an incredible name, right? Moms Demand Action. I mean, I think it's so powerful, particularly action, right? The notion that we have to demand action. We have to. We don't have time anymore. We haven't had time for a long time. And it gets to a point where people are just fed up with the lack of urgency that is been far too the norm for far too long. And so, I stand with Moms Demand Action because they're on the front lines. These are individuals who've come together, a community of folk who've come together and formed an organization to say, we are going to continue to beat the drum on this, and not just do so when we are confronted with yet another heart-wrenching tragedy where we have to witness the loss of innocence, but we're going to do it even in those quiet moments, if you will, even in those times where you don't turn the TV on or you don't go on Twitter and you don't see these stories. It's so important to continue to do that work day in and day out. And I stand with them every single step of the way. It's important that we do not only address these things when it feels like it's politically salient. It should always be salient. It should always be impactful because we're talking about our future. We're talking about you, right? And your peers, and making sure you grew up in a safe world and not have to worry about every space you go into.
Yes, there are so many reasons to feel unsafe nowadays. So many tragedies, so many things affecting us, and sometimes this could cause us to lose focus on issues like gun violence when we have other screaming issues just in our face. How do we stay focused on gun violence when there are these other screaming issues, there are these tragedies after tragedies?
Well, it's a really good question. And I think it's important to think about the meta issue, the issue that underlies why we struggle at times to deal with any number of issues, whether it's gun violence, whether it's our healthcare system, whether it's racial injustice, whether it's income inequality. The underlying dynamic that is causing problems is the role of money in politics. And we can utilize each of these examples at every instance to highlight how we've got to root out this corrupting aspect of our public square, which is meant to help us collectively do right by each other. I think it's important that we also understand that when we're talking about how we can love each other and how we can be more equitable and be more just in any way, shape, or form, we're also talking about less violence as a general matter. And again, that can be talked about in the context of, how we deal with, the fact that there are people out there who want to hurt us or want to oppress us, or versus how we want to deal with the fact that there are people out there who should not own weapons if they can't do so in a responsible fashion. It speaks to the fact that we've got to get to a place where collectively we are more loving, more thoughtful, more caring country. And so there's always an opportunity to talk about this issue beyond just the narrow issue of gun ownership and responsibility around it. There's a broader conversation about just how we relate to each other, how we get comfortable with each other in this space, how we connect with each other. We certainly want to protect our rights, and I believe we should protect always our rights. But how we protect them and how we do so in a way that enables us to continue to grow as a community and trust each other and love each other is critically important.
Great. This has been an amazing talk. It's been kind of enlightening about which issues to. Thank you. Thank you for coming in and talking to me about this.
Well, we've had our fair share of conversations over the last few years, and yes, I just have to say you have really brought so much joy to me. I think your focus, your dedication to the craft, it is a real joy to watch you blossom and continue to grow. And so you just reach out and call me anytime.
Thank you.
All right.
Inspiring, right? And finally, we have our fantastic panelists. Could everyone please introduce themselves? And let's start with Gigi.
Hi, my name is Gigi Goldfischer. I'm a junior at Arlington High School, or a rising senior. And I'm the director of Hudson Valley Stands Up, which is a student-led gun violence awareness and prevention organization comprising of different high school and middle school students from lots of local schools in the Hudson Valley. And we meet monthly and we try to come up with plans to take action towards gun violence prevention.
That's amazing. And why is gun violence such an important topic for you?
Well, as part of my generation, I feel as though I've grown up in a world surrounded by gun violence. I've been doing lockdown drills since I was in kindergarten. I was a high school student during the Parkland, and it just became very frustrating to see so much devastation and heartbreak and feel like all we were getting was thoughts and prayers. And so after being so devastated in Parkland, where so many innocent lives were taken, we just felt like enough was enough, and I decided to be a founding member of Hudson Valley Stands Up. And I just wanted to take matters into my own hands because a lot of politicians weren't doing enough.
And next, Andrew, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Zink. I have worked in the office of New York State Assembly Member Kevin Geher and New York State Assembly Member Jonathan Jacobson. And I graduated from college about 1 year ago from Marist. I am currently the treasurer of the Ulster County Democratic Party. And I've been pretty passionate about many different issues, but gun violence, is something that young people are really familiar with. And one of the reasons for me that, I got so heavily invested in it is, the platforms of social media, everyone having a phone, being so interconnected in this world that we have now. I mean, that also means that we're more interconnected with the struggles that people are facing and the problems that our society has. And so we get to see these problems up close, and we have to solve them. And so that's why I think we're all here.
Great, thank you. And Andrea, could you please introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hi, y'all. My name's Andrea Alejandra Gonzalez. I am I'm still 19. I am 19 years old. I'm the director of operations at Youth Over Guns and also the director of community and youth engagement at New Yorkers Against Gun Violence. Youth Over Guns, we are a grassroots youth-led organization, and we're dedicated to uplifting Black and Brown young people and their narratives in the gun violence prevention conversation, just because we are often so ignored in these conversations. I am from the city. I'm from New York City, and I got involved more specifically with organizations because my school, a couple of weeks after Parkland, we experienced a gun scare and we were in lockdown for a couple of hours, afraid of having a firearm in the building. But the idea of gun violence in my community is not new, and it's not talking about school shootings. It is talking about community violence. It is talking about police violence. It is talking about the way that guns are trafficked into my community, and anybody, an innocent person, can be shot and killed. And so knowing that folks that look like me, folks from my community that I love and care about, can be taken from me at any moment, I was moved to join an organization and do more than just advocacy work in my community, but take it onto a city scale, a state scale, and to a national one. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming, Andrea, and thank you for all that you do. And would our final panelist, Glenn, care to introduce himself?
Yeah, I just want to thank Rosendale Theater Collective and our friend Maitreya, who I've known for a few years in the activist community here in the Hudson Valley, for hosting and for organizing this. I think it is such an important issue, and I'm so thrilled to see the next generation of leaders like you guys standing up, paying attention, and working to effect or to bring about change. So I feel like that is so necessary right now, and it's awesome to see. A little bit about myself. I am one of the founders, along largely with Deborah Clinton, of Move Forward New York, which is a grassroots organization really designed to build activism, to build awareness, and to help us work together to build a better future for us and for the next generation. We have organized several events related to the gun violence issue, which in my mind is just, to be honest, it's such a no-brainer. You know, this is the only civilized nation on the earth that has 30,000 gun deaths a year, and the answers, the solutions are so obvious and so simple. And I love the fact that people in your generation see that and get that and are working to bring about change. So I represent Move Forward New York, and our entire goal is about helping you guys make for a better place for all of us. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you, and thank you all again for coming in to be a part of this panel. Before we move on to the Q&A, I have a few questions for you. If you want to answer a question, then just raise your hand and I'll call on you. This is sort of a conversation type format. And the first question is, Executive Ryan talked about weapons of war being carried in times of peace. Do you have any comment on this?
Sure, I think we probably all do, but I'll just kind of give my quick 2 cents on that. I've actually been fortunate to hear on several occasions Pat Ryan talk about this particular issue, and as someone who is a West Point alum and a veteran of war representing the United States, I think Pat is really well positioned to speak to this. And exactly like you're saying, Maitreya, Pat is, I think, pretty renowned for saying that it's pretty much insane for regular citizens to be able to easily own, access, and utilize what are essentially weapons of war. We can talk a little bit about the Second Amendment, and I'd like to at some point maybe flesh out some ideas on that, but a very short version is that the Second Amendment was not designed so that anyone in the country could pick up a weapon of war and destroy lives in the blink of an eye. So I'm fully aligned with Pat Ryan on that.
Yeah, I'll jump in here for a sec and say that I think Pat's experience fighting abroad and seeing that here is really valid in this time, and especially in this time where there is so much discussion around police brutality and the way that police in America conduct themselves. I think there's absolutely a place for a discussion about how our local police departments have become so militarized, and how that has not been positive for community relations domestically. And then that ties into other discussions, about militarization abroad, what we're doing with these leftover military material that ends up just getting given in many cases very cheaply to police departments when they don't need it. And this kind of militarization, is just a real problem, and I think arguably, harms our communities more than it does good. And so I think his insights on that are really important.
Thank you, Andrew. If no one else would like to comment, it's interesting that you mentioned the police, because that's sort of what our next question is about. How many of you have heard of HR 7120? HR 7120 is the Justice in Policing Act. It is a bill meant to help with police accountability. If H 7120 passes, police will have less immunity from the law. Police were meant to protect the law, not to be above it. And that is the purpose of HR 7120. What are your thoughts on this bill, and do you think it stands a chance of passing?
I could just go ahead. So I feel like this is great, making sure that we hold the police accountable in our communities. Like countless times, we have systems in place already in cities across the nation. In New York City, we have the Civilian Complaint Review Board that's like put in place to make sure that police don't get out of hand, and if they do, there'll be some sort of like repercussions. But the thing is, it doesn't really work very well in New York City. We have countless cases where people have not gotten justice. So I think moving forward on this bill, well, first of all, to be completely frank, I don't think it has a chance of passing. I don't think this country is ready to think about reform, let alone reimagining a police system entirely, which is what we need to do. I don't think reform is what we can. It's not a solution anymore. I think something needs to radically be reimagined in order to provide community safety. Community safety means reinvesting in education. Community safety means investing in services that actually help homeless folks. It helps healthcare. It helps housing. So I think the Policing Act is a good first step, but we need to really buckle down and sit down with community members and figure out what does safety actually mean, and who is defining the word safety. Is it people that don't even live in our communities? Are they people that even have interest in our justice, in our love, in our joy? So I think this is great, but we need to do more than just make sure that police are held accountable. I think there needs to be inherent systems changed where we do not allow violence to happen in any place in our country, especially not in communities that are impacted so much by other systems of inequality and injustice and oppression. But that's all I'll say on that matter.
Thank you so much, Andrea. What you said about it probably not passing, if people like us continue to protest for an entire overhaul of the police system, then maybe they'll give us HR 7120 because they'll see it as the moderate step. Just my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, and to add to that really quickly, I think that's really important to mention, because right now these protests have been happening. We're going into our 3rd week of protesting, and for the first time in a very long time, folks have been paying attention to the people and actually moving things along. If it wasn't for the movement that's happening right now, I am pretty sure George Floyd's killers would not have been charged. They're not convicted yet, but they wouldn't have even been charged. And so I think this is putting a fire underneath the lawmakers, under their hand, and making sure they're moving in the right direction that benefits the people. So I think as long as these protests continue to happen, and understanding that this is not a sprint, but it's actually a marathon, and we need to understand that this is not going to end in a couple of weeks. The Montgomery bus boycotts happened after a whole year, and we need to keep on going and understanding that this is not a one-time thing, and we need to pay attention to everything the police are doing, because people are actually dying. And if we don't actually recognize the revolutionary moment that we're in, we are going to be regretting that in the future, and paying for that with future generations. So yeah.
All right, does anyone else wish to speak on this issue?
If I could just add, I gotta say, Andrea. I think that your thoughts are so articulate and thoughtful on this particular issue and inspiring. So thank you for that. One thing that I'll add, I mean, this bill is largely about accountability, and I mean, any profession, any field, any worker, there's tons of accountability for making sure that you're doing the right thing, that you're behaving in an ethical way, and so forth. So a bill that is ultimately about ensuring accountability of the people that are policing, to protect us is something that in principle makes extraordinary sense. And I guess one thing that we've seen is an interesting thing with technology is this capacity for almost anyone to immediately videotape any situation. That's a game changer. That's a game changer in pretty much any field, and it's only going to sort of continue. So I kind of feel like the grassroots thing that a lot of us are connected with and are talking about, let's say this bill doesn't pass because there are too many people that, too many Congress people who are just, taking money from the NRA and are just not going to be supportive of something like this. We're almost at a point where with our ability to document and then to disseminate information, it's a game changer. The people that are videotaping police brutality moments and all these kinds of ethical breaches, there's almost like a large scale vigilantism, certainly in a way that can be really beneficial, that can really open people's eyes and say, wait a minute, this really is happening. Here's the proof. And so I just think that, using this technology to reach these accountability-based goals is something that's great. And I feel like your generation is like so much capable of doing exactly that.
I could just jump in. I'd love to. That's such a great point, Glenn. And I'd also love to just echo what Andrea said about this being a marathon, not a sprint, because with social media, it's so great that information can be disseminated really quickly. But I also have seen that things can just fall out of the media just as fast as they can become a trend. I think it's really important that this is more than a hashtag, and we understand that this is more than just a trend, something to put a black square so you can be seen as politically correct. This is far from over. This is only just the beginning, and I think we need to continue to keep our momentum. And even if this one bill doesn't pass, or even if we continue to face resistance, it's about the long haul and making changes for future generations and for the future of our nation if we want to have a safe world for our kids.
Do you think that there's a connection between police violence and gun violence?
Well, I'll jump in here and I'll say I think there absolutely is a connection between them, and I think if you look at European police forces, I mean you see police carrying methods of detaining people that are far tamer than what we have, and again this goes back to for me it goes back to community relations. I mean when you have people with lethal weapons, and you don't know if you can trust them, I mean, it's pretty difficult to have a relationship that can be productive and feel like these people are supposed to be public servants and they're supposed to be out there protecting you, and it's hard for community members to feel that way, while they're simultaneously feeling threatened, even if an officer is just carrying the weapon. I think it's very clear that it's threatening to a lot of community members, and there's ways that we could tone down our police to improve community relations.
Yeah, I think just to briefly sort of add to Andrew's point, I feel like by profession I'm a behavioral scientist, and one thing that behavioral scientists have easily and consistently documented regarding gun violence has to do with the effect of accessibility. With firearms being highly accessible, you see a lot more deaths due to guns and a lot more unnecessary deaths, period. And if we have a police culture like Andrew's saying, where guns of all different kinds and lethal weapons of all different kinds are a part of that culture and are highly accessible, it only makes sense that there's also going to be more brutality and more unnecessary violence. These things at any level within any sub community, they seem to go hand in hand. There's been lots of data looking at state by state information about the relationship between gun laws and accessibility of guns and unnecessary deaths due to guns, and the correlation between these and behavioral sciences is like incredibly strong. States that have very lenient gun laws that are very pro-gun have way more gun-related deaths than states like New York and states that have more sensible kinds of gun laws. And now this is something that when you talk to a lot of elected officials, sometimes it's shocking, it's mind-boggling when you talk to certain elected officials and they're like, well, it's complicated, there's a lot more to it. I'm like, there's not really, you know, to be honest. Like, and that's what I love about the fact that there's now like an entire generation of bright, motivated people, you know, kind of following the steps of the Parkland survivors and saying, stop saying how complicated this is. It's not that complicated. There's been documented correlations between these. There's thousands and thousands of gun-related deaths in the United States. And, you know, enough is enough. I really think that that's at every single level, that's the stance that we need to take.
Thank you, Glenn. Would anyone else like to say a few words?
I could jump in really quick.
All right.
I just want to like echo whatever everyone else said. There is 100% without a doubt a correlation between police violence and gun violence. You know, we can put out every single gun reform legislation out. We can actually do all of that, right? We can prevent people from getting guns from gun traffickers. We can make sure there's no more school shootings. But if a police officer shoots another person in the back, we still have a gun problem. That is still a gun problem. And it will never stop being a problem until that's also eradicated. So we need to really make sure and understand that these issues are tied together. It is not one or the other. It is undeniably tied. And so it also just goes back to the fact that, you know, we need to understand that like none of us are free until all of us are free. So like gun violence in like terms of like mass shootings and stuff, that's only like less than 1% of all the gun violence that happens in this country. And we need to understand that and put that into perspective. And so, and that 1% also, it impacts mostly affluent neighborhoods. So, you know, when we put all these gun restrictions on issues that specifically target, you know, ending mass shootings, we still have the whole other 99% that impacts so many people. And so we need to make sure that we're like targeting every single way that guns harm and create intergenerational trauma before we say that we eradicated gun violence. So, yeah.
Thank you. Gigi, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, I just want to add on to all the great comments that have been made so far about how I think that this really is a culture, in a lot of ways, a cultural issue, and how police brutality and gun violence are so connected. The fact that in America, we really do just have such a strong culture around guns, weapons of war, and then such a strong, like, sort of militarized police force that seems to have immunity and aggression. And if you look at other nations, you know, the United States has the most guns being circulated than any other nation. And of course, we have the most levels of gun violence and police brutality. So I think that it's really important that we not only look at this in a sense of, yes, guns are getting into the wrong hands in police officers, or the whole system is really, there's a systemic issue in the fact that people are being, so many innocent people are constantly being killed. But I think we need to look at this on a really larger about needs, what are the issues that are so entrenched in our nation are causing us to have such a cultural issue across so many different ways, whether it's police violence, domestic violence, gun violence in schools, whatever it is. There's a lot of problems in our country, and I think we need to address that.
And you know, Gigi, I really like the fact that you talk about this as a systemic issue, because I think, and a cultural issue, and I feel like, you know, we need to understand that. And it's really education that I think can help people sort of better understand that. But I just have a sort of quick anecdote, if it's okay, to sort of interject that, at least in my experience, put a real face to this issue, which is for the last several years, as part of my work, I've been traveling to China and teaching students in China in the summers, and it's been a really, really great experience. And about 2 years ago, I remember talking to a professor at the university I was working at, and one of the people I was with, another American, asked this woman who's a faculty member in China, and the question was, do you guys have the same kind of mass shooting issue here in China as we have in the United States? It was 2018, and there was just a huge mass shooting every day, it seemed, in the United States. This woman was driving the car, and she almost made a quizzical face, and she simply said this. She said, "We don't have that because guns are illegal in China." And that was the end of the comment. That's all she had to say. And I was like, wow, different norms lead to different outcomes.
And now I have one final question to the panel. It is the last question that I asked the Congressman. In this time of tragedy, how do we stay focused on problems like gun violence?
I guess I'll begin.
Feel free.
I think that the first thing we need to do is really educate ourselves and really acknowledge that it isn't gun violence or police brutality. It's not one or the other. They're not fighting for the front page. These are all really interconnected issues which we've addressed. And I also think that really taking action, if you get involved in different organizations, if you really get your family involved and have these conversations, you'll realize that progress is slow, it's taking time, we haven't solved the issue yet. And so if you understand that, then you're not going to want to give up. So it's really important that we're not looking for a quick fix. You're not going to solve an issue with a post. Like I said, it's so much bigger than this. You have to be in it you have to understand that we all have to understand that we're in this for the long haul, and we really want to see change. So that's how we're gonna stick with it, and that's how we have to stay. We're gonna see results.
Thank you.
If I could go next, I think it's really important to put things like Gigi said. We don't have to be fighting for which gets the front page of the newspaper, and I think it's also really important to understand that gun violence is the end product of so many other injustices that happen in our community on a daily basis. So, when people don't have access to food because they live in a food desert, that also brings gun violence into their communities. When folks don't have clean water to drink, that brings gun violence into our communities. Because we're in this crisis of COVID, people are home and alone, and they don't really have systems to rely on in their times of crisis. That also impacts suicide rates, which also impacts gun violence. So, all of that kind of stuff, we understand that these are all connected issues. And, gun violence is just one of the many ways oppression manifests itself in hurting generations to come. And so it's not about picking and choosing which fight we want to fight in. It's understanding that is a really violent way that these forms of oppression show themselves in our homes, in our communities. And we just need to stay dedicated to the work that we're doing and making sure that we are creating safe communities through education, making sure that we are focusing on what's happening on the news, and just really thinking in an intersectional perspective, and thinking on a deeper level that all of these things are undeniably connected. And we don't have to give one a higher plate than the other, because they're all connected. So
Thank you.
Yeah, I think if I could just speak next and
Sure.
follow up on what both Gigi and Andrea are saying. I mean, it's a big problem. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's the question that you asked, Matre, is a really good question, because you're kind of saying the world is such a mess right now. Between police brutality issues, structural racism, the coronavirus. And I think what Andrea said, and it sounds like you're getting a great education, because I think you're tapping into something so deep. There is extraordinary structural inequality in the United States. And when you look at why was the United States hit so much harder by coronavirus than any other country, off the scale, it totally maps onto structural inequality. It totally maps onto the fact that, yeah, we're a wealthy country relatively, but we have this gap between the haves and the have-nots that is outlandish, that is hard to change, because the people who are the haves are the ones who have the power, or have historically had the power, and they don't want to give it up, you know? And so it's really being woke and being educated and understanding these things and thinking about how can we systemically bring about the kind of changes that we need. So, you know, and exactly like Andrea is saying, like, where is the most gun violence? It's in the poorest places. You know, all the things that are adverse health related outcomes tend to totally map onto the issue of structural inequality. The people that have tend to have fewer of these kinds of problems, and the people who are the have-nots have more. And we know that, and the data are always there speaking to that. And it's really policy. It's really policy that has to affect that. So one more issue that kind of relates to that I wanted to talk about, that ties back to the issue of gun violence. We can look at the history, right? So when we're talking about how education can really be a key, we have to look at history. You know, we can't ignore, why does the United States have this gun problem? Where did this even come from? So just kind of a quick little history lesson that I'll put out there before I end is, if you take a look at the Second Amendment, which really sits, I think, in a lot of ways at the core of America's gun problem. If you take a look at where that came from, you know, first off, that's not about individual rights. It was about forming a militia, partly because people had to form a militia against the Brits during the Revolutionary War. That was an entirely different context than what we have now. And, you know, I wrote an article that was summarizing a connection between slavery and the history of slavery in the United States and gun violence. So here's a somewhat eye-opening point, which is, when you look back at the Second Amendment and the history of it, the states that were against it were the northern states, and the states that were for it were the southern states. And when you read back the historical documents surrounding that whole thing, the southern states were slave owners, the people were slave owners, and without guns, you're going to have a heck of a time keeping slaves down and under your control. And so, to a large extent, at least to my understanding, the problem we have with guns now at every single level goes back to that exceptionally dark mark on the United States history. So something to think about.
That's an amazing way of connecting everything together. Andrew, would you like to give an answer?
Yeah. I'll say, I think the other three panelists really expertly summed up everything I was thinking. I think intersectionality in this issue is the most important part of how we keep it in the public focus, because it ties into so many other issues. You know, we're talking about police brutality. We're talking about domestic abuse. We're talking about the role of guns has a place in discussion around suicide awareness in the United States that never gets talked about. And so I'm not going to go into each and every one of these issues, but the one that really is near and dear to my heart, you know, Glenn hit on when he was talking about the inequality that is out there. You know, I really think economic issues are where almost all of these problems stem from. And when you look at the vast inequality that we have in this nation, if people have some sort of economic power, you know, they wouldn't turn to some of the places that they do to find economic power, which can lead them to gun violence. And so if we can address that directly, then we can indirectly start addressing gun violence.
Thank you all so much for answering these questions. And now we're going to go to a Q&A. We would now like to open up things for questions for our panelists. If you would like to ask your questions live, join onto this Zoom call. For those of you who are on the Zoom call, there's a hand raising icon on the bottom. Please raise your hand to ask a question. This first question is for Glenn. You are a professor at SUNY New Paltz, and you've written for Psychology Today about gun violence. Can you speak a little about that? This is from Carrie in Rosendale.
Sure. Thank you, Carrie, for the question. I'd be more than glad to speak on this particular issue. You know, the first piece that I wrote in Psychology Today about gun violence was after Orlando, and I think that was 2016. And at that particular time, Orlando kind of stood alone. You know, the nightclub shooting massacre kind of stood alone at the time. It's so unfortunate that now you can name about 10 cities and 20 high schools around the country that all have that same kind of history. So it's really like, you know, we have to wake up and take a look at this. That first piece that I wrote about, I think, is something that I think is a really important lesson for people generally to think about. And it's about the concept of what we call multifactorial causation. People like to bicker about what caused some outcome. You know, was that shooting at that Orlando nightclub due to bad gun control laws, or was it because the guy was crazy? And multifactorial causation is it's a simple yet powerful idea that always is true when it comes to human behavior, which is that there are multiple causes of any particular behavior or behavioral outcome. That it's never simple. So at the time, there was people sort of from one political faction saying it's the guy was crazy. It had nothing to do with guns. That guy was crazy. He needed mental health help. And there was, you know, kind of other people saying, well, it's a gun issue. And guess what? It was both. You know, human behavior is complex, and violence always has multiple causes and multiple factors. Exposure to violence on television tends to be a factor. Physiological factors such as testosterone tend to be a factor. One's developmental history tends to be a factor. The number of factors that underlie any behavioral outcome, especially tragic behavioral outcomes such as a school shooting or something like that. When people go into their corners and just say it's this versus it's this, I think it's really useful in educating college students. You know, this is certainly what I try to bring about, is to get people to sort of step back and say, you know what, we don't need to have this argument in this particular way. Why don't we appreciate and understand the fact of multifactorial causation? And with that understanding, we can really stop pitting, you know, one cause versus the other. That just leads to really unhelpful and polarizing kind of arguments.
Multifactorial causation. I'm going to have to remember that.
You got it.
Thank you. Andrew, why has getting legislative action been so difficult? This question is from Anne in Rosendale.
Well, firstly, thank you, Anne and Rosendale, for tuning in and for the question. Well, I would definitely say, you know, it would depend on the state that we're talking about. But I would say, broadly speaking, you know, legislative action on guns has been so difficult because there is a very well-funded, well-coordinated effort out there to make sure that you know, legislation preventing gun violence and restricting the use of guns does not get passed. And the opposition, the people who are in favor of gun safety reforms, generally speaking, they are not nearly as well funded, and they do not have nearly as many of the tools at their disposal that groups like the NRA have. That was mentioned, you know, earlier, I think in the intro to this. But if you look at the role of the NRA in legislation, the NRA has arguably one main goal: kill all gun safety reform legislation, no matter where it be, no matter what form it comes in. And that's why even issues like background checks, despite the fact that public opinion is overwhelmingly in favor of gun safety reforms, you know, it almost never ends up happening. And that is not only because of the stuff that's going on behind the scenes from lobbyist groups like the NRA, but it's the fact that there is money being pumped into this culture war as well. And Glenn earlier in the discussion brought up how the Second Amendment specifically mentions militias. I graduated with a degree in history from Marist College, and our history has been rewritten. We have been led to believe that the Second Amendment was meant to give every individual whatever they wanted. To equate it back to those terms, do you think the founding fathers would want individuals having cannons? Or, weapons that just no one should have? Of course not. But I remember sitting in middle school and the teacher would say, what's the Second Amendment? And everyone just says, right to have guns. And that's it. No discussion about specifically what does it actually say? What was the intent of this? So I would say that, a well-funded and well-coordinated cultural and political assault around this issue is why getting legislative action is so difficult at the state level and at the federal level.
Got it. Andrea, this one's for you. Your organization, Youth Over Guns, hosted an event for Juneteenth. Can you tell us about that? This question is from Mia in Stone Ridge.
Hi, thank you, Mia. So it was actually really dope yesterday. We marched marched, if you know New York City, it's like pretty long, right? And so we marched from Chambers Street, which is basically downtown Manhattan, all the way up to 85th Street. And that was really significant to us because we marched from Tweed Courthouse, which is the DOE main headquarters, and then we marched up, we shut down 6th Avenue, and then we marched up to Seneca Village in Central Park. And Seneca Village, for those who don't know, was a community built from escaped enslaved Africans that were in this country who were stolen from Africa, and they ran away and they created their own communities. They built schools, they built churches, an entire community, but it was torn down to build New York City. And so it's really important in the work that we do. We need to honor the ancestors that came before us, not only the indigenous ones, but also our Black ancestors. And so that was really important, and it was really beautiful. We got to not only demand, for police-free schools, we demanded for the defunding of the NYPD and, holding accountable the police officers who have committed so much violence in our communities. But we also celebrated Black joy and Black youth, and, because we need to understand that Juneteenth is a holiday of celebration of the resilience of our Black community members. And so it was a really beautiful event, and I'm really happy that my team and I got to organize that and just participate in all that love and joy with New York City youth. So yeah.
That sounds amazing. This next question is for Gigi. How do you balance your activism with being a high school student? Oh, I'm going to want to know this. From Marcia and Stone Ridge.
That's a great question, Marcia. It's not always easy, and I think that's evident in how it's not always possible. Not every high school student is an activist, just because the demands of a high school student are very overwhelming. But I think that so much about it's about wanting to educate yourself. And so I think that's a lot of what you learn in school, you can be translated to what we fight for outside of school. And I think that we've touched on that really well today. And I think that it's just about, it's not about looking at the bigger picture about, yes, it would be great it's important to have a high school experience and go to class, whatever, but it's also about justice and the future of our nation and the safety of our classrooms and our nation. So I think that I've been inspired by a lot of wonderful activists and role models and other fellow high school students, and just the desire for justice is enough to keep going.
That's really inspiring. Thank you. I'm so glad you guys could all make it and talk in this panel. Before this event ends and you all disappear, we have some people to thank. Thank you, Executive Ryan, for your opening statement. Thank you, Congressman Delgado, for joining me for that fantastic interview. A huge thank you to the panelists for being a part of this conversation. I'm so glad that I got to hear all of your points of view and gain this new knowledge. Thank you to the Rosendale Theater, Justin, our technical director, the Teen Advisory Board advisors, who are Marcia Klein and Carrie Wyckoff, my mom. my father, Doug Motel, for assisting with Zoom and keeping this running smoothly, and of course, all of you for coming and watching this event. The Rosendale Theater has extended the streaming run of the documentary Parkland Rising through the end of June. If you haven't seen Parkland Rising, I very much recommend you do so, as this is an incredibly powerful film about rebuilding from a tragedy and the need to take action. My words can't do it justice, so there's more information at rosendaletheater.org. There's so much in this world that we need to fix, and at times can get kind of very overwhelming. But if we keep fighting, we can fix things. It won't be easy, it won't be fast. It's a marathon, not a sprint. But we can change the world. Thank you for coming, and keep fighting. Bye!